All right, the title of our lesson tonight is Obedience, Even When It's Awkward. Okay, I mentioned this a little bit on Sunday. If you have your Bibles, please turn to Daniel chapter 1 again. I'd like to revisit some of the events that we looked at in our lesson briefly on Sunday morning. We focused on chapter 3 when it had refused to bow down to the gold image of Nebuchadnezzar. But we looked at this story with Daniel and his three friends who, I guess you could say, found themselves in a very sticky situation that made it difficult to obey God. In verse 1, the text explains how the Israelites entered into Babylon because of the captivity. And among the first group entering into Babylon were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So let's start reading with me in verse 3. So Daniel 1, verse 3. It says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, right? Gather these men together. Young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Verse 5 says, And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them. So at the end of that time they might serve before the king. So what's going on in this story? Nebuchadnezzar was recruiting talented young men from far and wide who would come and be trained to serve before the king, kind of a training camp. In verses 6 and 7, you read about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being among those talented young men who were brought to be trained to serve the king. I want you to focus on verse 8 with me. Verse 8 says about when these young men came into this area. It says, But Daniel purposed in his heart. Remember that phrase. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. So pause there. We talked a little bit about this Sunday morning. But the law of Moses, which they were following, had very specific food restrictions, right? Dietary restrictions. Foods that they could eat, foods that they could not eat. And Daniel had set it in his heart beforehand that he was not going to eat anything unlawful that broke God's laws when he went into the king's house. So he made that decision before he even entered the house. So, imagine that situation. The awkward situation that these young men found themselves. That's hard to have to deal with. So, here they had this privilege of being invited as young men who fell into the category of talented, wise, good-looking, knowledgeable, quick to understand. Right? Zach would have been in that group for sure, and Jake. But they're called to come and serve before the king. And the king is going to be providing food and drink for these young men, and no doubt a place to stay while they're going through all of this training. But as Daniel and his friends learned more about what was going to be taking place here, he understood that in this 3-year training camp, the food that was going to be served throughout this process, while they were being trained and while they're learning the language of the Chaldeans, the food that was going to be served was unlawful for the Jews to eat, right? Forbidden by the law of Moses. And the food was going to cause Daniel to defile himself, according to verse 8. So here's the big question. What should Daniel do? How should he handle this situation? Should he and his three friends willingly and knowingly break God's laws during this 3-year camp and go ahead and eat the food? Right, that'd probably be the easy thing to do. They wouldn't have to deal with this situation. Let's just do it. After all, you could say everyone else in the training camp is going to be eating this food. How inconvenient to have to go and ask and try to take a stand. How inconvenient and awkward. He could have thought, God will understand because of the difficult circumstances. That's kind of a hard thing to do. God will understand if I go ahead and eat the unlawful food. So should Daniel break God's laws, or should he face the awkward and potentially dangerous situation and take a stand for God's laws? Two options there. In verse 8, we see Daniel's determination to follow the law of the Lord. And he realized that he was going to have to say something. He was going to have to take a stand and make sure that he didn't have to eat this food, no matter how uncomfortable it was. So let's read that again. Verse 8 says, But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Right? Not going to do it. Therefore, Daniel requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So I say, wow, would you look at that, right? Daniel was faced with this difficult situation, and what did he do? What was his intricate plan to get out of eating that which was unlawful for him to eat? He simply spoke up, and he asked. Right? He said something. And my point tonight is many times when followers of God today find themselves in similar situations, we don't always respond the way Daniel did. Sometimes essentially what we do in our Christian walk when things get awkward is we shut our mouths. And we do everything within our power to avoid any confrontation. And many times, children of God will give in to that which is unlawful rather than standing up for God's law. And so I ask you tonight if you've been there. I ask you if you've ever struggled with that. Has that been a hard thing for you, dealing with awkward situations? If you're a Christian, you're going to feel awkward situations a whole lot. So here's the major theme I think we can take from this section. Servants of God obey, even when it's awkward. Servants of God obey, even when it's awkward, even when it's hard. Let me give you some modern day examples of this. Number one, what do you do when your boss at work tries to schedule you to work Sundays for the next 5 months, and you're going to have to miss several worship services? That's an awkward situation, right? Do you have the courage to be like Daniel in that type of an awkward circumstance? To stand up and respectfully tell your boss, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to do that. Is there some way I could switch shifts with somebody else or find an alternate time to come in? Better yet, when you take a job, do you let your employer know from the very start, right, that, hey, I have made a commitment to Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I've made a commitment to assembling with the Lord's people. You see, we ought to be a group of people who have purposed in our hearts to attend the Lord's assembly. We need to have a committed attitude to God's laws to assemble. It says, I'm going to be here every time those doors are open. Right, not forsaking the assembly. I'm sure many of you guys have stories that you could tell about this sort of thing, examples. But I was talking to Justin the other day about it, and he told me a story where he was having to pick between 2 bus routes for his MTA bus driving job. Route number 1 was a great route, and it gave him the exact hours that he wanted all week. It was going to be perfect. He was going to have probably Thursday, Friday, Saturday night off. It would have been great, but if he picked Route 1, he was going to have to miss Sunday morning worship service, and he wasn't going to be able to be there for services. His other option was a terrible route, he said. He was going to have to work very inconvenient hours all week and throughout the week, but he wouldn't have to miss church. So I guess if you guys can guess what Justin did, he decided to go with the route that allowed him to attend worship. And it's funny, he told me that after the 3 months was over of that terrible route, when they got to pick their new bus routes the next time around, he got blessed with one of the best ones he ever got after that. He said he thought it was because he took a stand and he made a commitment to it. So, we as Christians do that. We purpose in our hearts as servants of God, and we are going to put Christ first in our lives in all areas. On that same topic, I was reading online of some Olympic athletes, and I like this one, who refused to participate when their events were on Sunday. It was pretty interesting. I wrote this one down. In 1924 Olympic Games in Paris, a Scottish athlete by the name of Eric Liddell refused to participate in the 100-meter dash because his heats took place on Sunday. Right? He wasn't going to race. So he forfeited a possible gold medal to worship God on the Lord's Day. But the happy ending to that story is he actually went on in those same Olympics later that week to win a gold medal in the 400-meter dash. So worked out in his favor. So I'd say that's commitment to the assemblies, commitment to the Lord's Day. So number 1, I just want you to think about that. What do you do when there's an awkward situation that conflicts with your commitment to the assemblies? Right? We have to deal with that all the time, it seems like. Number 2, what do you do when put into an awkward situation regarding morality? Well, let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. Let's say that you have a friend who is not a Christian, and they surprise you on a Friday night with some movie tickets for you to go with them to an R-rated movie. And they bought them. They were expensive, non-refundable. They're excited, and what are you going to do? Did you know that there are many Christians who would walk into an R-rated movie rather than face an awkward situation and tell them, I can't do that? That they sin against God's law rather than standing up for God's law. That's the way it is. But we ought not to fear man. We need to fear God. So we cannot be afraid to stand up for Christ and his standard, even when it's awkward. Here's a personal example. I remember an awkward situation that happened with me and Betty before we got married. Someone from out of town came into the Flint area, and they had bought us a little engagement present. And when we saw her, she was excited to show us what she had bought for us for our engagement. And she said, hey, I got something for you. I'm excited. And she reached in her bag, and she pulled out for us a big old bottle of champagne to drink with her that night. And she started opening the bottle and started pouring, getting the glasses ready. And I had to speak up and say, thank you so much for thinking of us for our engagement, but I'm not going to be able to, I don't drink alcohol. So here's the point. Sometimes we as Christians often find ourselves in some pretty sticky situations in this life where we have to go through some awkwardness if we're going to obey God's laws. I just ask you if you're willing to do that, because that's what's going to have to happen. We're not going to be like the world. We're going to look silly. We don't run with them in the same flood of dissipation. They'll speak evil of us. We know what the Bible says. But let's learn from Daniel's commitment to the law of the Lord and how he had purposed in his heart that he would not break God's laws even when things were awkward. So that's the encouragement for tonight. I think we always need to hear that. But if anybody needs to come make things right with God, the water's ready. If you're not baptized and want to obey the gospel. But if anybody else needs to come and make things right, please do so while we stand and while we sing.